migrations across Eurasia before, during, and after the age of Mongol conquest, that I would just basically talk about the period before migrations across Eurasia in the couple centuries before the rise of Genghis Khan actually created a kind of pre-existing condition that made the Mongol conquest possible and gave them the character that they have. This is just a way of sketching out the regions of Eurasia as I'll be using them in the talk. Now, right in the middle of this map, you'll see this region, Transoxiana, which has been important to Eurasia, to the trade, migration, warfare, population development, since the Bronze Age, certainly, but most famously since the conquests of Alexander. And it was equally important in the conquest of the Mongols. Transoxiana was an area of early agricultural development, particularly in grains, but also always in contact with the nomadic economies. You can see that there's a road, is a corridor here that where a road has developed. Archaeologists now believe that this road was basically built upon the trackways that had been developed by nomads moving between sort of these cities, Peshawar down here, through the Hindu Kush, up to Transoxiana. No. This is the beginning of what we often call the Silk Road. When Ferdinand von Richthofen gave it that name in the 19th century, there was a presumption coming along with it that somehow this network of trackways and sometimes roads, that somehow it had something to do with China originally, that it was for moving silk or other Chinese products, that the Chinese had invented it, or somehow that they governed or managed it. No, it started here and then developed east and west, so that it did touch China in the east and it touched the Levant more or less in the west. But it begins here, and particularly in Transoxiana, because of these qualities that Transoxiana had. Here you can see this is the road more or less as von Richthofen thought it to be. And this is a development of the Mongol period under the Toluid empires. And now you can see we've got the Mediterranean well connected here. China has got some additions. And there is this northern route that's been added, which was quite important for Europeans. Now, one of the sort of foundations that I want to establish for the later Mongol conquest are the general Turkic migrations taking place across Eurasia between about 200 BCE and 1200 of the Common Era. This is a very, very big story. It is also very well known. And so I'm laying it out here really as a prelude to two other more specific cases. What I mostly want to establish is that having originated in more or less Mongolia, very southern edge of Siberia, Turks or Turkic affiliated groups went every direction. They went east, they went west, they went south, they actually also went north. And in each case, what you find is that they move into very different environmental circumstances that then kind of determine what kind of effect they're going to have on the Mongol invasions. These trends here are what I think are particularly important, because as Turkic groups moved this way, they changed from having a basically nomadic economy to having a sort of mixed agricultural and commercial and nomadic economy. And as a consequence of this, their populations, many of the populations grew to be of substantial size. This could actually accelerate these migrations as groups tried to move away from each other, but it also created a role for them later that was very distinctive. This is Eurasia in the age of the Göktürk Khaganate. We're looking at about around the year 600. This is just before this empire broke into the eastern and the western halves. One thing I want to point out is that at the time being depicted on this map, not only this empire of the Turks here, but also this empire in China was created by the Xianbei people who were not Turks, but had very strong contact with Turkic groups over their history, and subscribed to some basic political ideas that were recognizably Turkic. The Sasanians here are not Turks, but they are in constant contact with Turkic groups around them. Here, the Alans, the Bulgars, the Avars, in a loose way, these can all be described as Turks. And the Avars have their, Khaganate right in Europe. And of course, they were later the great enemies of Charlemagne. They were the western end of this Turkic spectrum of the 7th and 8th centuries that basically established all these political orders across Central Asia. I'm looking at it now because I want to talk about this group, the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs at this time already, we can recognize them for who they are. They're living sort of through here. And they have become distinctive because they have a writing system that has originally been derived from Syriac and Aramaic, but they've made some changes to it that will make it very influential for other cultural groups across Eurasia later on. They are primarily Buddhists, but among them you'll also find Christians, and in fact, they're quite important in the so-called Asian church that is constantly seeking recognition from Byzantium but not getting it. The Uyghurs are also part of that. Later, they have their own empire. They actually go this way, eastward. They capture the old Göktürk capital. It becomes their capital of Ordu Balik. And it is extremely cosmopolitan, right? People who are visiting it, it's surrounded by agricultural land. It has a strong Chinese influence in its material culture, pervaded by this Mahayana Buddhism from Central Asia. It's very connected to all the commercial activities going across the Silk Roads. So the Uyghur Empire here is itself set up to become a seminal cultural influence. Under Uyghur influence, it is important to remember that Mongolia was not an isolated place. Mongolia was connected, particularly this way through Turfan, to the Silk Roads, and Western Mongolia had a bit of population. It's Eastern Mongolia, which is where the Mongols come from, that was actually on the isolated side. Here we're looking at 1,000. The Uyghur Empire is gone, but Uyghurs have been distributed all through the great cities of Transoxiana, all through this at Dunhuang, the Xixia Kingdom, and through the cities. There are a number of them in Mongolia now under the Khitan or so-called Liao Empire. This is just a reminder, once Chinggis has put together his confederation, which he did by defeating Turkic peoples, right, here who were in Western Mongolia, and then he comes down this way and he heads for Transoxiana, partly because it's the center of Uyghur influence and Uyghur wealth. It's strategically important because it's in the middle of everything. And so it's also a staging area for the wars that he'll conduct later against Khwarezmia down here and ultimately against the Seljuks. The two great areas that Chinggis is eager to bring under his control is northern China and Transoxiana. So the Mongols are the commanders of these armies, but in order to put this whole organization together, they are depending on Uyghur expertise and the expertise of some, small number of Arab Muslim merchants who are in the area. But the Uyghurs are handling the scribal duties, keeping lists of things, handling communications among the parts of these armies, and to a certain extent, handling the finances. Now, the Kipchaks are a group of Turks who, by the time we take up their story, let's say at the end of the 12th century, they are largely nomads, and they are competing with other nomadic groups in this area on what I've called the Kazakh steppe. And so, partly in response to this competition, they are moving. They do move westward into the, what you might think of as the Russian steppe. Many of them go southward into the Muslim world and join the ranks of these Mamluk armies, right? These are technically they're slaves of the caliph, but they're actually professional soldiers. Some of them very ambitious, some of them very prestigious. In an earlier period, they were Oghuz and Turkmen. Now, the Kipchaks are arriving as well, so they can become Mamluks. They become part of the Mamluk armies of the Ghurids down here, and ultimately of the Delhi Sultanate. They move through Khwarezmia, through the Abbasid Caliphate, this way into Ayyubid territory in Egypt, where they are also Mamluks, and in fact, they're one of the founding populations later on of the Mamluk dynasty. So the Kipchaks are moving all over this way in response to pressure from the Mongols, but they eventually come under Mongol domination, or some large part of them does. If we look at these campaigns after the life of Chinggis, this is in the Ughdad period. These are the later campaigns of the Mongol Empire, when there was, for the short period that there actually was a Mongol Empire. And here you can see where we're trying to extend the empire into Southeast Asia if possible. Actually, it wasn't possible. Through Korea, into Tibet, that went all right, towards Russia, and this way into the Levant. The Kipchaks are important in all of those campaigns, and in fact, the commanders of the Kipchak forces become honored and influential people in the Mongol campaign structure, and for this reason, they are transferred towards Russia, also into Transoxiana, and to China, so that at the end of the empire, you find them in all these locations. Particularly in the Yuan Empire, there was a contingent of maybe 10,000 of them sent to Beijing. They remained there, right, when the empire was over. They went westward into the Jochid Uls. Now, the Kipchaks are more or less the main force of the Jochid armies. This is why the Jochid Uls, which is also the Golden Horde, is sometimes called Kipchakide, or the Kipchak Horde in some sources, because that's how important the Kipchaks were. The Kipchaks were the main force at the cities, Old Sarai and New Sarai, that the Mongols had created for themselves here in order to be able to control the princes of Kiev. This is basically a Kipchak operation, and it's pretty much thanks to Kipchak guides and guards that this northern route was established to take Europeans to the Mongol capital at Karakoram. That's how this happens to be the route of Jana Planakarpini, but this was not originally part of the Silk Roads at all, but it became an important sort of track, and that was largely thanks to the operation of the Kipchak armies. After the Mongol empires kind of disintegrate in the 14th century, the two sultanates, empires, where the Kipchaks are ensconced, the Mamluk here and the Delhi Sultans over here, both of those political orders survived to the 16th century. And the Kipchaks remain very important in that all through that period. That is, the Turkic populations provide the heft for the Mongol conquest. They're a much, much larger population. They have a long political history in Central Asia. Okay. Now I want to look at a distinct population. It has some connection to this great scheme of the Turkic migrations, but is also somewhat different. This is a group that I call the Sarts. Sart is an old word. I think the first attestation is probably in Akashgari's dictionary of the 10th century. He has Sarts in there as a word that means, it literally means the leader of a caravan, but has become a generalized term for a merchant. So the merchants of, let's say, the overland road system, the merchants of the great cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, these individuals who are moving back and forth across zones of language, law, religion, are the Sarts. By the time we get to the rise of the Mongols, the group I would call the Sarts are Muslim, almost overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim. You can find Jews among them, you can find Christians, but their distinct characteristic is they are Sunni Muslims. A lot have ancestors who were Arabs, a lot are Persian, a lot were Turkic, a lot were South Asian. Their culture is basically Persianate. They speak Persian, they write Persian. So the first attestation of this word in Mongolian, or as a Mongolian way of referring to this population, is in this little stela here. It's now in the Hermitage, in which you can see their mention right there is the first word. Basically, this was just a little note. The Sarts are not really even important to this. They're just there in order to establish the time period. That year was 1222. That's the year in which he's trying to consolidate control over Transoxiana, and he is facing Khwarezmia down here. Khwarezmia had been in control of Transoxiana, and Chinggis he's destroyed Karakatai, he's destroyed Karakan, but he is now looking into Khwarezmia. This is a very heavily populated Muslim area, Persianate in culture. It was it's basically, this is the old heartland of the Abbasid Caliphate. Chinggis needs to go to war against them because they refuse to accept that he is controlling this whole territory up here, Transoxiana. This is the first time that Chinggis is looking into the Sartic world. This is commercial. This is Persianate. This is very urban. Parts of it are very heavily urbanized. For the first time, the Mongol campaigns are going to involve large armies of hundreds of thousands. I mean, previously we've been talking, pretty small numbers. Now it's hundreds of thousands, very heavily fortified. This is a very, very significant challenge, and it is part of this Sartic cultural spectrum. Chinggis does succeed in conquering this area, and when he does, he acquires the Sartic population as administrators, as financiers, as in some cases, bookkeepers, as diplomats that he can send out to other places. A tremendous resource for him. And in fact, what happens to Sarts in the Mongol empires, Kublai Khan, once he's he has the Yuan Empire here, and he's controlling all of China, he brings Sarts in to do a lot of his local administration. Kublai, he has a certain number of Chinese officials. He doesn't always trust them. So he wants his tax collectors and bookkeepers and, most important record keepers to be people he has brought in from Central Asia. Many of them Uyghurs, many of them Sarts. The Kipchaks are there, but they're in the military, right? They're doing something quite different. The Sarts can become local governors, and in fact, down here in this area of Yunnan, sort of here, he sets up a Sartic governor there, who then himself establishes a little bit of a dynasty. So these Sarts are controlling this area into the Ming period. And in fact, the descendant of the governor there, Shams ad-Din, the most famous descendant is the great mariner of the 15th century, Zheng He. And so Sarts remain part of the population in China all the way through the Ming period. In China, they become famous as the so-called Simu Ren. So Sarts are most famous in China as this immigrated group of Simu Ren, people of the various categories who did most of the administrative work, particularly the provincial administrative work for the Mongols in China. This Simu Ren, this term, it has a kind of folk etymology in Chinese as being people with various colored eyes, right? That's clearly not what it meant. I mean, Mongols had various colored eyes. Turks had various colored eyes. There's no point calling anybody that. But they are people of the various categories in the sense that some of them, most of them, are Muslim. A few are Jews. Some are Christians. So those are different categories. Also, some are officials. Some are merchants. Some of them could be in the military. Those are also the various categories. So what it really means is that these are the people of all trades, right, who are brought in by the Mongols to handle any facet of the administration that they needed to have handled. That this is kind of a counterpart to the Kipchaks, in the sense that the Timurids here, the Jagadids here, and in fact the Ming Empire of the Chinese all have a certain amount of dependence on the Sartic populations to handle their money and to handle their administrations. And so Sartic influence continues well after the period of the Mongol empires. So, in conclusion, what I want to say about this is that this is one of those instances in which patterns of migration before the rise of the Mongols has determined its geography, the ability of the Mongol forces to penetrate into some very densely populated places. And they learned this through the Uyghurs, through the Sarts, and through the incorporation of large Turkic armies into their conquests. So there's this kind of substructure, right, that is actually existing all across Eurasia before the Mongols' rise.